So we haven't got our traditional housekeeping slide up, but we'll put that up later. But just to say, we're not anticipating fire alarms today, so we may need to pay attention if there is one. There we go. And you may already have discovered, but toilets are just outside the doors here, as tea and coffee facilities are there as well. And at lunchtime, we'll give you a little bit more detail about the lunch arrangements. Okay, so we've got a full day, but we wanted to start by giving you a sort of a background, a scene setting of where we currently are through the HMA EMA task force, just to inform thinking through the workshop. So it's a standard disclaimer. But I want to kick off by having a sort of a thought process of sort of why now? What is the need now? Why is there this increasing interest in big data, real-world evidence in the regulatory processes? And this is not a new problem. We've known about this for a long time, the unknown generalizability of clinical trial results to normal clinical practice, and in some disease areas, that's as low as 2%. And also high-risk groups, such as pediatrics, pregnant women, and geriatrics, who are often excluded from trials. So this really is more and more demanding new approaches to gather complementary evidence. And we also have a rapidly changing scientific landscape with increasing data breadth and depth, which is delivering us wonderful genomic and proteomic biomarkers of disease. It's enabling us to understand the disease, understand disease stratification and patient subgroups. But it presents challenges as well. It may result in smaller, focused RCTs or shorter ones, or indeed present situations where an RCT is not possible or feasible, and we have to think of other approaches to give us confidence in the efficacy. And sort of linked with this, we also need to understand current treatment patterns and outcome patterns. And current treatment is getting more and more complex, especially in the oncology area. And the validation of these short-term surrogate endpoints, which we sometimes see in these gene therapy trials or rare disease trials with long-term beneficial outcome, is incredibly important. And we're seeing many medicines through the EMA where they have a conditional license and they're going to require long-term follow-up of both safety and efficacy. And all this is predicated really on the basis that we have an increasing data availability. It's coupled with technological advances, and this is offering us now new opportunities to store, mine, and analyze data across multiple data sources. But there are challenges. We know this. There's a vast volume of data which is increasing rapidly. Every 24 months, the frequency at which EHR data doubles. And it's not going to get better because we know there's health apps and more patients are expecting to use digital health services in the future. But that's a volume issue which could be manageable. The more challenging issues are the variability around the data, the complexity, the heterogeneity, the unknown quality, and the provenance of the data, which is a very challenging situation in the regulatory sphere to use these data which have uncertainty around them. And as I said, the data landscape is changing. If you look on the left-hand side of the graph, this is the sort of traditional data that we're used to dealing with through the regulatory system. Clinical trial data, very structured data, very well generated of known provenance, post-authorization data, adverse drug reaction reports, and more now post-authorization studies. And this is all informed by the published literature. But over time, we're increasing uses of real-world data, the data generated through normal clinical practice outside the constraints of a clinical trial, in terms of prescription databases, EHRs, and registries, and more omics data. This is the really challenging data, genetics, proteomics, metabolomics, and more. And coupled with this is the mHealth data and the social media data. And mHealth is coming more and more into clinical trials. So we are going to be faced with data from mHealth to consider as part of marketing authorization. And I suppose the vision is, how can we move towards, this is the vision of an integrated, personalized medicine approach, where integration of all of these omics with clinical data may allow me as an individual to know whether I will respond to that drug appropriately or whether I as an individual will get an adverse drug reaction. So on the basis of this, back in November 2016, EMA held a big data workshop. Many of you may have attended. And the objectives were really to start to define the landscape from a regulatory perspective, to clarify opportunities and challenges, and then really to try and decide what is needed for us to exploit and utilize this data for regulatory decision making. And there were some key emerging trends and issues that came out of this workshop as an early thinking. And very much in the workshop, attendees and participants emphasized the need to understand the clinical utility of the data. We shouldn't just collect data because it's there. We need to collect it because it answers a useful question, or we think it will answer a useful question. And so because the effort invested has to be rewarded by the benefits. And we also recognize opportunities and questions are different depending on the stage of the product life cycle and the context of the disease. Accessibility is a huge issue across all data sets, but particularly in observational data. And coupled with that is data governance and privacy protection, and, which are absolutely key if we're going to enable data sharing across borders and across data sets. And finally, validation. We need mechanisms, firstly, to integrate this data, to generate meaningful knowledge, and then we need to validate those associations so that we can be confident to make regulatory decisions on the basis of them. And I suppose the overarching theme from that workshop was the need to develop a deep understanding of the data, to define the strengths and limitations so that we can appropriately challenge the evidence that arises from it. And on the basis of that, we formed the HMA EMA Joint Big Data Task Force, which has 4 work streams. And the first work stream is to do exactly that, to characterize the relevant sources of data, to define the main format they exist in, and to try and understand the format that they may be presented to us in. And this is very much from through a regulatory lens, this analysis, because there's huge amount of scientific literature in there, which we're not going to characterize that across all data sets. But we want to do this from a regulatory perspective, and we think that's the novelty. The second work stream was to try and identify areas of usability and applicability of the data, both now and in the mid-term and in the far-term future. And we also did a gap analysis. So we ran 2 surveys across our European regulatory network and also with industry to try and understand the current status of expertise, what were the future needs and what were the challenges. And that will generate, we hope, a list of recommendations and a roadmap. So I just want to give you a little bit of thinking around the characterization and the key messages that came out of that, because I think it will inform the workshops this afternoon. So just to say, in case you're not aware, we have divided our task force into 6 different groups to allow us to focus on what we felt were the relevant buckets of data. And a cross-cutting group is a data analytics subgroup, which is now starting on the back of the characterization work done by the various the subgroups to think about how data analytics can be applied across these data sets. And so I've arranged our key messages currently into data sharing, data linkage, and acceptability. But I've not drilled down into individual issues associated with each data set. I've tried to sort of think of some general concepts which we can then discuss at the workshops. And I've talked about challenges, enablers, and risks for each of these areas. So if we think about data sharing, what we first want to know is a little bit more about the data. So the challenges there are characterizing the quality. Often we can't change the quality. The quality is what it is. But we need to understand the quality because that tells us which questions it may answer. And of course, it's heterogeneous. Within data sets, it's heterogeneous, and then across data sets. So then the challenges are really creation of suitable platforms, frameworks, distributed data networks to enable sharing of this data, And coupled with that, of course, in the clinical data is the need for robust data anonymization, which is a significant challenge if we want to maintain the scientific utility of the data. And of course, we need governance to ensure privacy across these borders, because we imagine, certainly within Europe, that we will be sharing data across member states. But we need to have an eye on global harmonization and implementation, because some of these data sets are new and fairly immature. So can we, at the start, drive a global harmonization in these data sets so that we don't have to look back in 10 or 15 years' time and say, oh, for goodness sake, we've got lots of standards, lots of terminologies. We have an opportunity with some of these data to start at the beginning. So what would be enablers? Well, global standards, data formats, terminologies, common dictionaries, common definitions. And also, in some of the sort of genomics world and in the proteomic world, instrumentation standards. The technology is moving at such a vast rate that a test done today may not be back compatible with a test done 5 years ago. We don't want to lose sense or lose the value from historically collected data. So we have to understand how we can relate back to genomics or proteomics or whatever it is generated 5 years ago. We do need standardized assays so that we understand that a result generated in one lab is the same, gives the same result as generated in another lab. Some assays can be very, very variable between different labs. And we need to share raw and processed data, because I think that will give us confidence in the data. This point is a very important point. We need to motivate or generate a data sharing culture. And for that, we need political support, and we need rewards. We need to reward people for sharing data, especially in the academic area where they need that data to generate their next grant. And we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to start to generate the appropriate motivation so that people feel it's worthwhile to share their data. And of course, patient and healthcare engagement and communications are key. And what are the risks? The risks of funding, obviously, because we need sustainability in this area. There is no point generating a platform that then falls off a cliff at the end of 5 years because we have no sustainability. But we want to avoid overly onerous access and limited access, because that deters people from coming in to use the data, and avoid duplication of platforms. And lastly, future-proofing is a key need. And data linkage, well, similar challenges really. If we're linking across different data sets, we have to think some of this data is incredibly dynamic, it's complex, and it's evolving. And in proteomics world, it can be spatial, it varies depending on the cell type, and even at the suborganelle level. So how are we going to share this? We need the metadata around it. And the data may also be dependent on the sample choice. Certainly in the metabolomics world, if it's urine or blood or whatever sample, it will potentially give us a different result. In real-world data, clinical data sets in Europe, we have the challenges of different languages and also different healthcare systems which drive different content across the data sets. Some have secondary care data, some don't. So some include pediatrics, some don't. So characterizing that is also important. And commercial interests are also challenges around data linkage. And what are enablers? Well, IT solutions are key here, and certainly this is an increasing world, an increasing interest in artificial intelligence and deep learning, but we need the infrastructure, and then we need the analytics sitting on top of this data to generate results we can believe in. And we can help by having common data elements and common data models. I've touched on the availability of metadata and standardization before, but we need to have reproducibility so that we can replicate results, because that generates confidence. If we can replicate the results across different data sets, then we'll have more confidence in the outcome. And again, I keep saying robust data protection. And the risks are similar: funding, lack of sustainability, but of course, the more associations you reach, more likely you may be to get spurious conclusions. So you have to have strong statistical analysis and the pace of change again. And lastly, acceptability. The challenges here from the regulatory perspective are validation. We need it validated. We need to be confident we can differentiate causality from coincidence. We need reproducibility. And within that, we need to consider sample choice, storage conditions, and temporal factors. And understanding and quantifying the uncertainty around any risk estimate will give us confidence. If the risk estimate is 2, but the confidence intervals are plus or minus 1, now, well, we're not maybe that confident. But if your risk estimate is more and your uncertainties are still high, but you've got a confidence in, you then have more confidence in the risk estimate. And we need to avoid black box algorithms and potentially biased algorithms. Enablers, again, and this is really key, transparency. We need to understand the justification for the database choice. We need novel methodological approaches, and we need transparency around the methodology. We need a framework also to address bias, and we need to have reproducibility of associations. And the risks there, of course, are maintaining expertise in all our different stakeholders. Developing guidances which keep pace with this changing landscape is very challenging. And what's next? We thought a little bit about what's in the sort of far future, or maybe 5-10 year time, and we thought epigenetics. This is an area where we already see methylation has consequences for drug responsiveness, and there's increasing interest in this area. But very, very challenging data to understand. And also microbiome, lipidomics, and metabolomics. More omics are coming in, even more variable, even more dynamic, with temporal changes, and some of them are very hard to sample. And sort of closer to home, we need to develop healthcare data sets in member states with no representation. Currently, we have a skewed representation within Europe. And of course, data analytics coming down the line, machine learning and artificial intelligence, which Nikolai is going to touch on in the next talk. But clearly, we need policy initiatives to motivate this data sharing culture. And then finally, very quickly, the gap analysis. I'm just going to show you some very quick results around the industry survey results. We had a disappointing number of responses, only 37, but luckily, or fortunately, they were nicely split between big companies and smaller companies. And we had some interesting results. And I created a synopsis there in the interest of time. But there were differences between what the smaller companies, the SMEs, and the larger companies felt. For example, in terms of the greatest impact of big data, the larger companies thought target identification, patient stratification, and post-authorization safety were key areas, where the SMEs were more focused on patient-reported outcomes and disease prevalence, potentially because of an interest in the mHealth world. Highest concerns for larger companies were real-world data sets and social media, and for the SMEs, omics data sets were a concern, as well as imaging data. Key challenges in the use, well, I think I've gone over most of those: data access, data privacy, data harmonization, data validation, and reproducibility. And international challenges were harmonization again. How can we harmonize within and between countries, including access rules, data protection and privacy, data standards, collection and validation, and of course, quality and access, which will vary internationally. And in terms of regulatory measures needed to address these challenges, clear regulatory guidance, and I've touched on the difficulty there of keeping pace with the changing world, and facilitation of access to data was also raised. But fostering data sharing is key. So that's it. I'm going to pass over to Nikolai just to say that we hope to report at the end of 2018, and these are the task force members. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move straight on. I'm already overrun.
Thank you very much, Alison. While my presentation is being pulled up, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Nikolai Brennan. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at the Danish Medicines Agency and the acting co-chair, together with Alison, of the EMA HMA Task Force on Big Data. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today. I think we'll have a great day ahead of us. And also welcome to our colleagues from Japan, and also we will have a representation from the US later on. I will just make a few brief remarks on all of these big data, because I think that as regulators and as citizens, there are some things that we need to keep in mind, and I'd like to turn the clock back about 300 years, because I think we're asking a lot of the same questions that we did at the end of the 1700s and 1600s as well. And that is, when is an observation the truth? When are a lot of observations the truth? And how can artificial intelligence help us predict future observations? And the example with the white swans, I think, is worth bearing in mind now that we're bombarded with not just one observation, 10 observations, or 1,000 observations, but maybe 50 million observations in the sense of big data. We have a tremendous amount of opportunities, but we should bear in mind that the theory behind the evolution of science about asking the right question, framing a hypothesis, designing a study that can answer the question is still more relevant than ever. Also, when is evidence good evidence? In this post-factual world, we are continuously confronted with news based upon single observations. Patients who have had a bad experience are blown up on the front pages of newspapers, and very quickly reporters are going from one observation to a generalization, and we as regulators have to face questions on this all the time. Case reports a bit more solid, cross-sectional surveys and case control studies, absolutely better, but still at the top of the pyramid we have the RCTs and the well-matched meta-analysis. So I think every time we have artificial intelligence generated big data, we need to ask ourselves, how does this contribute to the evidence that we see it? Because it can, but we have to treat it the right way. It has to be balanced, and we have to remember the scientific evolution that brought us here today, and of course embrace the new opportunities, but do it the right way. From a regulator's perspective, data supporting a registration still need to be reliable, non-random, and they need to present some idea of causality. They need to be validated, as Alison also said. They need to be reproducible, and they need to be predictable of future responses to the intervention. And when we have new technologies, here's one of the example of new technologies, we need to ask ourselves, will they provide us with this? Can they predict the response of future generations and future patients? Clinical endpoints where measurement might be improved by AI technologies is already present in a number of different devices. Here are some examples. Telemedicine is already coming in, huge advantages to patients, especially in remote regions where you can have access to expertise. But typically regulatory approval required demonstrated clinical benefit and a positive benefit-risk ratio. So a surrogate is not always the same as a clinical benefit. So every time we try to introduce new surrogates, new measurements, we need to ask ourselves, how does this reflect the clinical benefit and the patient's benefit in the end? New AI-based endpoints in clinical trials. Where can the AI technology create new opportunities? Sheer volume of data may strengthen the case. Masses of data may increase precision, but may not increase accuracy. This is one of my favorite slides, basically showing that accuracy and precision don't always go hand in hand. I think that we are at risk of ending up in the upper right corner here, where we with great precision can predict something that may not be accurate. So with masses and volumes of data, you do risk going off on a tangent and hit the mark. It's just not the right mark. And therefore, we want, of course, to be in the lower right-hand corner with the use of both of these new technologies. Patient safety, always at the paramount of our thinking. How can technology, which constantly evolves and learns, be validated? When do we validate it? Against what do we validate it? Because an AI algorithm today is obviously not the same as it was yesterday, and it's not the same as it will be tomorrow. So we need to answer these questions. And basically, this is the framework that I would like to set for our discussions today, because today is focused on solutions. We've had a lot of meetings and discussions about the challenges of big data, the challenges of artificial intelligence. I think we're all very well aware of the challenges. So today's meeting is really intended to bring us towards thinking creatively about solutions. And we have brought industry, we have brought regulators, we have brought academia and patient representation. I consider that as part of academia as well, into the same room. And there's really nothing that is off limits in the discussion today. Alice and I are really hoping that we will have some great discussions. We've asked the presenters to give presentations about 20 minutes and leaving plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. Please use that to bring your ideas forward. Today is intended to bring ideas and solutions for some of these conundrums that we are facing right now. And with that, I would actually like to give the chair to you, Patricia, who will take us to the next agenda point. Thank you.
Thank you. Before Patricia starts, I'd just like to remind you that the workshop is streamed, and so if you ask a question, and I would like to welcome everyone online, but if you ask a question, please use your mic and please give your name and affiliation. And then when you finished your question, switch the mic off because the camera comes back to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. So, as many people will know, we have the EMA Patient Registries Initiative, and what I'm going to do today is tell you about some of the lessons learned from that so far. Why have we set up a Patient Registries Initiative? What is it? The core concepts? What are some of the lessons? And how can the regulators move forward and support the use of them, and some conclusions? So this is a slide that shows a little bit of information about the registries that have been used so far, because as you know, registries may be requested of or imposed upon companies as part typically of risk management plans or other, especially in relation to evaluations of post-authorization for advanced therapies, orphan products, or in pediatric use. So the EMA conducted an examination of imposed registries between 2005 and 2013. And what you can see there is that, firstly, registries weren't imposed that much. Around 10% of products requested a registry. And typically, they were mostly used for orphan products or in exceptional circumstances licensing. And it wasn't all straightforward. Actually, there were quite a number of problems. Only 9 or just over a third of the registries reported that there were no problems in setting them up, recruiting, and reporting. But typically, there was a big problem around accrual and low enrollment for other reasons, affecting well over half of the registries. Delayed starts, protocol amendments, and so on. And if you look at the graph on the right, what you can see is the standout feature there is the failure to recruit to target numbers. The other thing that struck me particularly was that 7 registries were never commenced at all for various problems, including capacity around recruitment, but also because the products weren't funded or weren't going to be launched in Europe and so on. So there are various reasons, but we ended up with 24 registries for which we could make these evaluations. So that takes us then to thinking about, well, what are the problems and why are these problems encountered? And quite often what we've seen in looking systematically now across the area is that the approach is often suboptimal in terms of scientific and resource terms. Because there are large numbers of registries out there, but the important thing is that they weren't set up for regulatory purposes or to undertake post-authorization studies to inform marketing authorization holders about the life of the product. They were set up typically by clinicians or by groups of patients to follow perhaps the natural disease outcomes and responses to certain treatments for sure, but definitely not primarily for regulatory purposes. That said, though, there's a great failure to opportunistically use the registries that are there. There's also, when you look at it, quite a discrepancy between the data collected by the registries and the data typically asked for by regulators. And then there are challenges when you've actually got a registry on board or start up a new one in terms of the recruitment, in terms of data quality, and in terms of sustainability for the registry. And in particular, the issue of data quality exercises people. So for those reasons, companies, marketing authorization holders may choose to set up their own registries and very often have done. Against all that background, the Patient Registry Initiative was launched in September 2015 with a cross-committee task force to guide it. And its aim, as written there, to improve our use of registries. And the pilot phase in 2016 actually showed a great keenness to engage with registries and to use them. And following up on that, we conducted 3 area-specific registry workshops: cystic fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, and for CAR T-cell therapies. And we have another one coming up in June on hemophilia treatments. So the core concepts, just to quickly mention these, what do we mean when we say a registry? Because the definitions do vary depending on which side of the Atlantic you sit. In our terms, it's an organized system using observational methods to collect uniform data on specified outcomes in a population that's defined by a disease, condition, or exposure. And as regulators, we typically prefer patient or disease registries because for many of the treatments in which we're interested, we are in a better position to be able to undertake comparisons between treatments. And these registries are also typically better integrated within health systems. There were multiple components, but 2 main components of the registry initiative strategy. Firstly, coming out of the workshop in 2016, what we found was that the regulators asked the pharmaceutical companies for a study to be done, a post-authorization safety study that might be conducted in the context of a registry. The companies contacted the registries, so the registry holders. But rarely, if ever, did the regulatory authorities and the registry holders speak. So you had this immediate and early dissonance that we've spent now quite an amount of time seeking to address. The other thing was thinking around the concept, the difference between a registry, this open-ended collection according to the definition that I've just put up, and the idea of a study that may be located embedded within a registry. So looking then at the 3 workshops we've conducted, why did we choose these? There were approaches to us from the registries because there was interest in the area. There were new products recently authorized and many more in the pipeline in some cases. And there was interest in, especially in relation to the quality issue, what are good enough data for regulators to consider, some sort of process for evaluating the quality of the registry data. And all of these workshops included participants representing the big groups of stakeholders. And it was really interesting when you stand back now and look at the 3 groups of registries where we held the workshops. The first one with cystic fibrosis showed us a really well-organized European-wide network of registries that already had many of the things in place that people desired when they spoke in the 2016 workshop, especially in relation to core common data elements with common definitions in place. In contrast, the multiple sclerosis registries landscape was very much different, quite heterogeneous. There were 2 big main groups, really: the European MS platform, which is run by and focused on patients with a huge interest in patient reported outcomes increasingly, and the big MS data group, which is a more academic group with registries in Europe, Sweden, France, Denmark, and so on, as well as big MS data, as well as the MS base, which is an international registry based out of Australia. But across those 2 groupings, there was limited collaboration, and there was little within group core agreement around what are the core common data elements that are needed. Nobody had sat down, as they had with the CF registries, to agree, well, what are the data elements we absolutely must need? The CAR T-cell therapies workshop then was different again, because here you have 2 large registry networks that are already very collaborative, that are already thinking about data element and definition harmonization and so on. So we have steps and illustrations here that take into account what Alison just said about the challenges that there are relating to real world and big data use for regulatory purposes. We learned lessons, first of all, in relation to governance. Firstly, that the regulators and the companies need to be aware of what's in the registries and what can feasibly be collected by them, because typically we ask for everything, and sometimes companies come to the studies as if they are clinical trials with very high levels of demand in terms of quality, data recording and so on, that just isn't possible in the world of a registry. And I was thinking about this yesterday, sitting in the clinic seeing patients. filling in their forms for bloods that we wanted, looking at test results, speaking to the patients to explain all the things we were doing, then doing the letters to go out to the GPs and other healthcare providers. And then I'm thinking, imagine now if I had to start now and put some of this into a registry, and we do for some things. But when you think of that capacity to do it, it actually, you end up as a clinician sitting with less and less time talking to the person that's the focus of your interest, really, who's the patient there. So we have got to find ways to work around this and be as pragmatic as we can about what we look for and how we get what we're looking for. The registry holders then are challenged very much by what are the arrangements whereby we can share data legally, with the consent of patients, with transparency. And they also need to facilitate the sharing that we need, policy for timely data sharing, because this is a big thing for both the companies and the regulators. And they need to have a system for centralized data application requests. And indeed, the CF registry group does have that, whereas, for example, it's much more heterogeneous with the MS registry groups. And most of all, reflecting on what I was just thinking about in the clinic, the registries need sustainable funding. Some of them have. The CF registries are pretty well set up. The MS registries, less so. And across Europe and America, the CIB-MTR, for example, in America gets funding that really supports its infrastructure very, very well, whereas the European Blood and Marrow Transplant Registry across Europe has much less sustainability in terms of its funding. And those differences very much reflect what they're able to do. Most of all, as well, we need transparency. Thinking about another lesson was what I touched on already, the core common data elements. What we found actually, despite whether there was or there wasn't a list, having a list of core common data elements showed us that registries could agree. But in the case of the MS registries, again, what came out of the workshop was the capacity to say, what are the elements that we absolutely should have across registries, and what are the elements that would be nice to have? Similarly, that came out of the CAR T-cell workshops as well. Registries are really willing to think about additional data that need to be collected to support a study, but time and time again they said we need a lead-in time, we need discussions, we need to know what it is we want, and we typically want a time limit on it, because what we cannot have is an ever increasing requirement to add to the data that are collected. They can't sustain that. So that early discussion is really important. The other thing that comes out of this for the marketing authorization applicants and holders is the need to think about what's needed for post-authorization data early. And you can understand why there's a certain reluctance to do that, because in thinking about that, you need to commit personnel time and effort and so on for in anticipation that you will actually get an approval, when the eye of the company is focused on just on getting the approval, and then we'll think about the rest later. But that later may be losing you lead-in time. And I've spoken about the more ask and the risks potentially to the quality of the data. This little graphic just shows us where we would like to be. We would like to be on the left-hand side, where companies and the regulators are thinking really early on about what we're going to need in the post-authorization phase, especially in relation to additional data collection. So thinking about it, especially at those pre-submission meetings and validation and scientific advice meetings. But typically, we're all sitting right up at the, we're mostly sitting up at the right end of the arrow on the bottom, where we're reactive. CHMP and PRAC evaluate and make requests for data, and then everybody runs around thinking about it, and you've actually lost all this lead time. So we all need to move back to the left-hand side of that arrow, ideally. Data quality. This was a huge thing right from the start. The question from both the registry holders and the marketing authorization holders and applicants, what are good enough data for the regulator? And Alison's touched on many of the challenges of that. We've got some key components of quality there. I don't need to read them out for you. A big issue is the source data verification. There need to be clear procedures around how that's done. But again, that calls for infrastructure and support for the registries to be able to do that. And then there needs to be an internal data quality assurance system within the registries, Maybe external audit needs to be considered. And then we need to think about, well, what are the data quality indicators we need to think about? And ideally, we have the same, and this supports the hospitals, the outpatient clinics, the community medicine and so on. We need similar data quality and routine collection of data as we would for registry-based studies. And then we've evened up the field, and we're not, the demands are much easier to meet if that quality is there. So the regulator then getting involved in this, we can look at, or we can provide guidance on, well, what are the quality parameters that might be needed? So what does the registry do right now? And in terms of what it does and how it does it and the quality procedures it's got in place, what might we find these data acceptable for? So the Cystic Fibrosis Society Patient Registry has just gone through a qualification procedure, and a qualification issue was issued in opinion was issued in January and was published for consultation on the website. And you can read that. It closed for consultation in early April. And the qualification procedure is this voluntary scientific pathway that leads to a CHMP opinion or a scientific advice on something to do with innovative methods or drug development tools, or something that's potentially of value and used within the regulatory process. And in relation to the European Cystic Fibrosis Patient Registry, the qualification opinion said that in its current status and standing, it is potentially suitable for regulatory purposes for studies looking at drug utilization, efficacy or effectiveness, and drug safety evaluations, depending, of course, on the protocols and all of the rest of the detail to be worked out for an individual study. So what can we do in addition to support use of disease registries? We can provide methodological guidance, and we've started to work on that. The scientific advice processes, protocols are there for the post-authorization safety and effectiveness studies, and that can be used. The inventory of disease registries we've now created, and is a useful resource just for identifying what registries are out there, and that's on the NCEP resources database. And we can, as I said, facilitate the interactions between the stakeholders. So to conclude, we have this paradigm shift. There are many advantages, though challenges, in using patient disease registries, but we can collaborate. The quality issues, I think we need to work hard on, but we can address together. We need to address this gap between the data collected in registries and what we typically want for a regulatory study. And we can create and use tools that will help advance the process, and in particular consider the data quality issues. This is our webpage for further information, and you'll find our workshop reports up there, as well as the qualification opinion on the CF registry. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Any questions to Patricia on the use of registries? Yes, please identify yourself and use the microphone.
My name's David Gillen. I'm representing UCOPE today. I'd just like to get a perspective on sustainability and funding. One of the key, I think, values of the registries as per the regulatory guidance is their need for independence from pharmaceutical company funding, if you will, or independence. But clearly, the levels of data quality are appropriately very high, and I just wondered if those are mutually acceptable. Is it possible to have this level of quality with, frankly, the challenge of actually funding these registries? And are there any discussions about alternative ways of supporting registries to ensure they are independent, but also that they fit the standards that are required by the regulator?
Well, the CF registry qualification process has shown us that within the current funding methods that they've got, they have actually been able to collect data of a quality that the regulator would find appropriate. And that, I think, gives people some assurance. There's another registry going through the process at the minute, and that will bring up issues around quality and so on and sustainability, but again, bring mechanisms to help solve them. The CIB-MTR model, where there is federal funding for the registry in addition to the funds that it gets for doing studies and so on, is perhaps one to think about. But the question is, where do the funds come from, and how do you stratify registries then to get them? How do you? So that's a whole other conversation that needs to be had. There is then the as you say, like, registries are paid if they participate in company studies. But again, there has to be some agreement around the transparency and the data sharing and so on, that is at arm's length, and that it is not going to be a product-only registry that sits within the auspices only of the company. And you can see the tensions around some of the data access issues there. But again, in the conversations with the registries and with the marketing authorization holders and regulators, there is a willingness to work through this, but we need to find some sort of a system to do it, which is why we're talking systematically.
Yes?
Nigel Hughes from Janssen. Thank you for the presentation. I'm following up from that last question, because registries can often be, and generally are, very expensive. And I was kind of surprised, actually, that didn't come up as a particular issue in your presentation related to funding and sustainability. But there are initiatives. I mean, for instance, in Belgium, healthdata.be, if people are familiar with that, but that's a state-sponsored approach to multiple registries, trying to stop also another issue, which is things like replication. I think you mentioned earlier, lots of people seeing a need for evidence and then running around trying to, and that happens many, many times. Many companies are involved in the same disease area and so forth. But longer term, where do we see the place in registries in amongst all these new initiatives around big data, real-world data, federated networks, utilization of electronic health records, and so on? Are there not potentially in the future less expensive and maybe more even efficient ways to capture data than in the traditional registry approach?
So Alison will probably wish to add to this, but we wouldn't see registries as the one and only resource. Typically, they are in rare disease areas, or where you really want to capture patients where there are very few of them in a particular area, and you want to cut across borders. You want to make absolute best use of the patients that are there, be it for a treatment or be it because they've got some rare disorder. So the registries lend themselves in that situation very well. But if we pull in all the big data technologies that Alison's spoken about as well, you can see how registries could be supported by some of those, but that you're not thinking about a registry for every single situation. And they need the sustainability questions, so they've got to have the buy-in of the clinicians who are running them, because typically what we see is that, for example, if there's a product registry set up, it will have a lifetime. Whereas for many of the patient and disease registries, they go on for years and years and become a repository in their own right. But they have managed to fund themselves up to the point. But now I think what we're seeing is this move towards what are the data, how good are the data, and what's the most parsimonious data set that we can use that will satisfy many needs, but not all needs.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And thank you to the questions. Don't forget to switch off your microphones, please. Next, I'd like to welcome Bert Leufkens to the chair. Bert is a professor at the Utrecht University and obtained his PharmD and PhD degree from Utrecht University. Since 2007, he's the chair of the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board. Moreover, Dr. Leufkens is active with several national and international platforms on pharmacoepidemiology and regulatory science. His key interests are relevant for the center are pharmaceutical policy analysis, regulatory science, international health risk assessment, public health, orphan drugs, and scenario planning. So very warm welcome to you, Bert, and thank you.
Thank you, Nikolai, and good morning. And it's so nice to see so many colleagues and friends and past colleagues. Actually, I left the MIB in the summer of 2017. So, but yeah, but that doesn't. Well, when we talk about big data, and it was also highlighted by the introductions of other speakers, we talk typically about a topic that is on the interface between drug development and regulation and the inside world. And I would like to start with this little example, because this is about trial results and stock prices. I think a very nice study where it shows that when certain trials come out, positive trials and negative trials, it has an effect on the stock prices. well, this meeting is not about stock prices, but this meeting is about how inside world and outside world has influence on each other, but also how information, rumors, blurs, everything that go forward, backwards may have an impact. This is, of course, not rocket science, but everybody here in the room knows examples from own experience where they have been involved in a certain project, a certain drug development project, or certain regulatory decision-making, where the outside-inside world is, of course, reacting on that. And this example is about trial results and stock prices. And this is also affecting, I think, the question we have to address today when we talk about how will big data and how is big data also affecting the drug development and regulatory process. And Nikolai and Alice said, well, this meeting is about solutions. I'm not sure how we'll come with solutions, but I want to share with you some reflections, particularly from the regulatory science space, where I believe that is important also when you look at that interface between the inside and the outside world. Because at the end of the day, this is not an internal game. That is something that is really at the heart of how society, how stakeholders, patients, payers, politicians also look at this space. More and more, we see that big data are affecting virtually all phases in drug development. And I look at drug development and regulation as a river. More upstream, you see the science, clinical development, where industry, the applicants, academia contribute to new concepts. And Alison showed already a very nice palette of the exciting movements we see there. More omics, more ways of biomarkers, more ways also of drug discovery and drug development. And more downstream, we see the regulators, and where we are today. But more importantly, we have, of course, also the interface with the HTA and the payers, the prescribers and the patients, and other stakeholders that are interested in not only the regulatory process itself and the decisions that are made, but also the blurs and the social media and the rumors that are around that. And we are aware about that this is not always very evidence-based, not always very rocket science, but at the end of the day, it really has an impact on all these phases in drug development. When you look at the river, mostly the rivers go more of an upstream to downstream, and that would be not the picture I would like to present here, alone because everybody, I think most of us in this room know that this is not only a linear process, it goes also forward backwards, where certain consequences experienced by patients go upstream in the direction of the companies and the regulators. And the whole dynamic is in the middle of everything that's happening around us when it comes to big data. But keep this in mind. It is also important that we look at what's happening in the environment of pharmacoepidemiology, clinical investigation of certain problems. I look at the heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. We look at the associations between big data and fractures. But also, Brun, a colleague in the pharmacoepidemiology space, wrote a very interesting article in the European Journal of Epidemiology just last year, where I say, okay, we have all these tools now, and the world is ahead of us, but how to deal with the false positive signals, but also how to deal that particular regulators, but probably also the companies, have to investigate every signal on their robustness and on their merits. And that dynamic is not only science, it has also to do with the way we interact, the way we also have governed the data, but also the way we position ourselves in that space. In my view, there are three pivotal data contrasts, and maybe some people in the room will talk about paradoxes in drug development and regulation. The first is that I believe that there are more data points ever from clinical trials, but still, many decisions, particularly also in this building, on the benefit risk are made on the high levels of uncertainty. That's a contrast, because you would expect more data, more clinical trials, better certainty on the level of uncertainty, and I will come back to that. There is a big cry out, for good reasons, for real-world evidence, observational data, registries, and big data, etc. But maybe that's a little bit provocative, but the impact on real regulatory decision-making at the moment is rather limited. And I think we have to understand why. What's the reason here? And finally, the data space for authorities, and probably I think the same holds for the industry, is heavily regulated. But hardly any regulation for social media, academia, NGOs, because everybody can do their work and dance there, while the regulators and the companies are very strictly regulated what they can do and how they can maneuver. Well, these three contrasts are, of course, not independent. They interact on each other, but they have one underlying issue, is that whatever we come up with in terms of data analysis, statistics, presentation of data, we have to deal with these contrasts because they also reflect the contrast we have with society that expect from us, drug developers, regulators, that at the end of the day, patients have access to medicines with a positive benefit risk and of good quality, and of course, also when they are affordable. Well, that's a few words on the data points. And I come back to this paper in the New England, and maybe some of you have read it. It's an intriguing paper from the industry perspective, where Michael Rosenblatt compares the situation between 2002 and 2012. And while he goes in quite a number of parameters, the number of endpoints, procedures, eligibility criteria, countries, et cetera, but when you go to the bottom of the table, you see that the data points, it's huge. So you say, well, from the perspective of collecting data as the fuel for robust decision making, there is a paradox here, because if you look at, and I hope people do, at the European Public Assessment reports of many dossiers we have had over the last couple of years, and the same holds also for FDA and what I see at the PMDA website, and when it comes to Japan, we see that contrast between a lot of more data, but at the same moment, a lot of uncertainties. And people may say, well, that has to do with the complexities of the diseases we have to deal with, new complex therapies, etc. But that contrast is more than only science. There is more on that we have to elucidate to make progress. And it's interesting to see also when we go into the orphan space, and this is data from our own group, where Ruben Duinhoven looked at the number of patients included in European procedures, pre-approval trials in the period 2000-2010, in total 200 dossiers. When you look at the medium size of the pivotal trial in an orphan drug dossier, it's more than 400, and I think that's progress. We made progress over the last decades in that, and that's a compliment to the companies, to the patients, to the physicians, but also probably also to the parents to make that happen. But still, if you look at how the discussion and more and more that is also in the public space, we still have quite a number of uncertainties. This is also true when you look at, and I take this example of the oral cancer products approved in the 2013 and 2017 period. These are the blue ones here on this table. You see, and I go down now to the bottom, a very nice reflection of the data I just showed you. More than 300, 500, and in 2017 it's even close to 700 patients included in the pivotal trial. And that's not only the only data, it's more in the dossier, but that's there. You would say, well, that would drive a more robust way of making a decision. But that's not true, because if you look at the number of conditional marketing approval, well, in 2013 it was 3 out of 5, 2015 it was 1 out of 5, etc. So that picture of more data, so robust decision making is not true, at least not reflected by this data. So what does it mean? It means also that when we put this in the context of regulatory science, and I make this summary here in this slide, keeping up with the best science there, looking at the way we look at the data and what are the best standards and best methodologies to make a decision, but also studying the regulatory system as such. Does the system deliver? Because I think virtually everybody in this room is part of that system, either directly or indirectly. We have to deal with quite a number of interesting challenges, but also both opportunities. Well, some of you will know that we in our environment in Utrecht, but also in other places in the Netherlands, have a strong history of regulatory science, fueled also by the initiatives of the MIB, together with in the past with Christine Gispen, but now with Marion and Hans and other colleagues in the field. Closely related also to a number of IMI projects and public-private initiatives, with always the question, okay, how can we explain that when there are more and more data out there, and giving the topic of today, we will have more data even in the future, what does it affect in terms of decision-making and making progress here? I would like to highlight 3 issues here when it comes to evidence generation over time. And Nikolai, you had a different graph, but more or less the same message, I guess. In the time, you know, when we go back in the early 19th centuries, etc., we had anecdotal stories, patterns of clinical observation. So overall, low overall validity, both internally and external. Well, then we had in the 40s and the 50s, in particular, I think in the 70s and the 80s, the randomized comparisons with high internal validity. And now we see in this period, okay, how can we add in an appropriate sense, because we believe, coming back to the gold standard, very often it's not enough because of the lack of external validity, but also in terms of efficiency, improving efficiency, not always needed. Well, so we are in the space now of more observational data, real-world evidence, where we at least try to have more external validity. And very often, and that's the problem, of course, at the expense of the internal validity. And that trade-off is also at the heart of the discussions about how can big data also contribute to that. Well, keep this in mind. I would like to highlight three areas where that is an issue and how also we can solve that when we have a regulatory science perspective on this issue. First, the whole discussion is about factor VIII products. I could have taken a lot of other products, but here there is always the discussions, are there any differences between the individual products when it comes to inhibitor antibody formations? And that's an issue, of course, where patients and the clinicians, but also the companies and the regulators are very interested in. And in this particular space where we have both randomized data and observational data, we have very good registries, and this is an example of that published in New England in 2013 about the rodent study. And I was at the CHMP in that moment, and we had a lot of discussions about, okay, we have clinical data, we have randomized data, we have observational data from very good registries, but they do not always show the same. They are not always in the same direction. And at the end, well, that was my observation and the observation of many colleagues as well, the randomized data that were really driving the decision and not the observational data. And how can we explain that? Is it just because of the lack of robustness? Is it about bias? Is it about confounding? Or is it more? And my observation is it's not always science. There is more in that than only the distinction, okay, when we have randomized data, we should trust them, and we should not do that at the expense of the observational data. One example. The second is very much on when there are controversies, and this is a very recent one on an HES, and there was a lot of turmoil around that and publication in the BMG, and when you look at the website of the EMA, there's also quite some interesting information about that. But this is the controversy where a regulatory decision is challenged for tons of reasons, and I don't go into the good of the bad of that, but it happens. It happens almost every day. And how can we sort it out? Because the companies are, of course, also part of this, but also the patients and the clinicians. And big data can either help, but also make a lot of fuss into these issues. My observation so far is that big data were not always very helpful to really fuel a more productive dialogue on this, because we really need dialogue when it comes to the solutions, etc. On the other hand, you could say, well, we have these controversies, we had them also on safety of other products, etc. But we have to sort that out to make progress also to answer the question, how can we bring big data in a better space on the regulatory decision? And then the third is, of course, HTA. The HTA where, and this is an interesting paper by Bert Johnson and other regulatory colleagues, where they looked at a number of anti-cancer drugs and how more downstream HTA decision was made. I mean, they compared England, Italy, Germany, and France, and I don't go into the details, but other studies have shown the same. It's a very erratic picture, because in some countries it was supported, and in some other countries it was not. Some countries are still thinking, that's always good, but it doesn't help the patient and the decision making, etc. So big data in the regulatory space, in my view, cannot seen independent of what's happening more downstream when HTA organizations, physicians, formulary committees, etc., have to make also their own decisions. Well, what about the way forward? Of course, there will be more exposure to big data. And what does this mean? And I would like to share with you 5 reflections. Big data will fuel regulatory science work through uncovering hidden information of drug effect. That's good news, because this is not seen there, and we have a lot of examples there out there, and we should keep and continue to work on that. I know also that EMA colleagues and other colleagues in the regulatory field are working on that, and the same is there in the industry, and I think we should have that dialogue, how to combine these results. The second is that there will be more learning about the natural disease cause, options for disease interception, and so on. I think that's good news as well, because big data, fueling the more upstream activities in the industry, in academia, drug development, is important, because at that moment, there will be also an insight in what does it mean for the indication, 4.1. What does it mean for, at the end, the personalized approach of targeting the best responders when the product is on the market. The third is the gap or the convergence between the drug label and what is happening in daily practice will become more visible. I think that's a key area, because at the end, of course, you can consider the label as an artificial contract between the regulatory and the companies, but I think at the end, the drug label will lose its function, its societal function, when it is not close related to what's really happening in clinical practice. And we all know examples where the drug label is not reflecting real practice for various reasons. And we all know that the system we're working is applicant-driven. When the applicant don't move, the regulators don't move either, unless when there is a real safety issue, etc. And that gap of convergence will become more and more visible. And people will react on that. So we have to move there. There will be, in my view, more, I'm not sure whether the word parallel is the right wording here, or post-hoc assessment of the benefit risk by academia, civil society, activist group, etc. Because big data are more available. Well, you have a country fellow, Peter Goetsch is a good example of that, where people say, well, what the regulators are doing, what the companies are doing, we can do the same. And they come up, and that will drive a lot of reactive maneuvering, both by the regulators and also by the companies, to sort that out. But more importantly, and that will be also part of many discussions today, are we also able to translate big data into acceptable evidence for decision making? I'm a little bit skeptical on that at the moment, but I hope that we can make progress there, because it's not only the scientific guidance. If you look at the scientific guidance of the Efficacy Working Party and all the other working parties in the EMA environment, in the regulatory space, you see very little opportunities to include big data in the regulatory decision making when it comes to real discussions about the benefit risk and decisions about the benefit risk. But the surroundings, so the learning, in my view, will be very much also stimulated by the big data exercises, and I think we should work on that. So, Chair, these 5 reflections are part of my thoughts to this topic, and I hope they will be helpful also for the rest of today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bert, for this very interesting presentation. I really agree with you on the challenges and also on your presentation on the internal and external validation. Do you see a way that there could be a feedback loop from the real world back to the regulators? Should we move towards that? Should we have a system put in place where the real world data goes back and forces the regulator to reconsider the original approval, the original label, rather than the reactive one where we're looking at the applicants to bring it forward? Or is that just a future vision, or would that make sense in your head?
Well, actually, partly it's already a reality if you look at the pharmacovigilance system with the risk management plans, with everything that around that. If you take the recent valproate referral and the procedure there around that, where we discovered that some regions of Europe were not aware about the most recent insight, etc. Well, that is something I hope that we can improve in the future. It is not only big data in itself, but it is also the willingness to go beyond the dossier in itself and also to actually to open the curtain, so what's happening outside. And I know, I'm now looking at Peter Arlett, I know that the regulatory system itself is not always very helpful to include the outside data, but I know also that Peter and other colleagues here in the room are working very hard also to include the outside world into the regulatory decision making when it is, of course, appropriate. Yeah.
Any questions for Bert? Please identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Giovanni Martinelli from Italy. I'm the scientific director of Istituto Ricerca a Carattere Scientifico Meldola and lead of the cooperative project Next Generation Sequencing for leukemia. And I totally agree with your presentation that we are in a great opportunity, but also difficulties to interpret the big data in order to get approval of the drug or to make a better decision. In my opinion, we have 3 levels of problem that I would like you can discuss a bit. The first is who produced the big data, how we can be sure that the big data are true, are well done. That is something that is not standardized sufficiently in this moment, at least in my country. And I'm in Alliance contro il Cancro networking, EMA networking, several networking, which we find difficulty to get real big data that has been produced. So first. Second, every time we get a cancer, we don't have just one mutation who drives the leukemia or drives the cancer. Every time you get 6 or 7, until you enlarge your view on the big data, you get 7, sometimes 30 mutations that are so-called driver mutation and not passenger mutation. We know that this has been very relevant. So there are 2 points arising from that. The first is, are these mutations synthetically lethality against the harboring of the drugs, and are we able with the drugs to interfere these synthetic lethality mutation? First. Second, are these synthetic lethality mutation mutually exclusive in the pathway, and the drugs that we are approving is working on this mutational load? Third point, which is for me more relevant, every time we have to make a reimbursement, we are every time in defensive situation, at least HIFA, Italian Agency for Pharmaceutical, pay, but they have a defense situation. They pay cost of reimbursement and so on, has to be payment by results. It's a defensive system. I believe that we have to be able to go in a direction more positive, more strong as a EMA, as we introduce the big data and using the knowledge database, which are now available, who takes a lot of information, getting clear evidence that some mutations are very, very important for the pathology, and then consequently the drugs will be very successful if it will be approved. That's my 3 points that I would like you to comment, please.
That would require another lecture, I suppose, but just briefly, coming back to your mutation example, I think for sure there will be, and you see it when you look at, in my environment at the campus, we see proteomics group, genomics group, and they come with new leads for better treatments, and also they move to public-private initiatives, etc. So that's moving. But the second point you made, in my view, and that's a very important, that, and for that reason I think that the EMA and the HMA took the right decision. There is no way out that you can say, oh, big data is out there and that's not us. It's part of where we are. And that may, and whether we like it or not, it will affect drug development and regulatory decision making almost every day, because it's not only us. So we have to be prepared, and both in academia, but also in the regulatory space. And coming back to your example on should we be more or less positive to new treatments, etc. Well, that's at the heart of the point I made on the interface between regulatory decision making and the HTA. It's no way out that you can see that there's different worlds. They are connected. Maybe from various legal points they have different decisions, but at the end of the day they are connected, particularly connected when it comes to science. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Francesca Cattarin from the European Consumer Organization. The first question is, your professor said that data space at the moment is heavily regulated for industry, but less when it comes to academia, NGO, and social media. So if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And the second question is, building on the example you made on valproate, don't you think that at the moment we're underexploring the opportunities that big data offer, for example, for post-assessment, and maybe abusing sometimes too much for regulatory decision-making, for the approving of new treatments? Thank you.
Yeah, two excellent questions. Well, the first reflection I had on the level of regulation of how different stakeholders are, the way the industry can move and the regulators are partly very much in the law and in the governance around it, etc. But every European individual can go to the web and start to make an analysis and come out with a statement on a certain analysis, etc. And very often that's good because people have their freedom to do that. On the other hand, that may also cause us a lot of turmoil or false positive or whatever. And I don't want to argue against that, but we will anticipate more and more situations where, given the access to this kind of data, where stakeholders that want to challenge either the industry or the regulatory environment do the analysis and come with a different view on a certain product. You could say, okay, that's good, and I think it's good because it is part of that dialogue, but that means also that the regulatory space should be prepared to have that dialogue and also be prepared to have that access to the big data environment. On the valproate issue, I just mentioned it as an example where there was diversity in how individuals across Europe were informed. And you would expect that this is an old product, a lot of information in the literature, a lot of information in the label, etc., etc. But still, not everybody was aware about the most recent data and information. And I hope that the discussion on the big data gives also access to more platforms, particularly also for the patient communities and the consumer communities, because we see a lot of diversity in terms of access to good information. And I think a group like you is very much working on that, and I think you should continue on that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bert. In the interest of time, I think we need to move on. So there'll be opportunity for more discussion in the workshops. So I'd like to welcome James Kugler, who's representing EFPIA. James earned a degree in biomedical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and has research experience at Harvard Medical School, MIT, in bioinformatics, computational biophysics, and genome sequencing. You started your career at Sigma Aldrich and is now Chief Digital Officer of the Merck Group, and where he's currently responsible for the digital transformation of the group globally. And James is going to talk about building bridges, turning big data into value, which is clearly a pertinent topic. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you. It's I'm very, very happy to be here today, and extremely happy to be here today representing EFPIA. I also apologize. We have a new font at Merck, and it shows up sometimes in different ways in different machines, so we'll see how the formatting looks on this. But content-wise, it should be exactly the same. I also want to preface this with I'm not an expert in the pharma industry, right? My career has really been on the science side, and how do we sell to scientists? We obsessed at Sigma Aldrich, so I was looking after sigmaaldrich.com, we obsessed over how do we make science faster, right? And it seems trivial, but things like how do I get a reagent to someone in 24 hours instead of 2 weeks is something that really starts decreasing the time it takes to do an experiment. To help us with this, we built a lot of really advanced, actually, machine learning and AI capabilities. We were able to take all of the data that we had, bring it together, combine it with how products were used in literature to be able to make really targeted recommendations to users. And so over the years, we built up this fantastic resource to be able to do this. And in 2015, we were then acquired by Merck, KGaA, German Merck, for $17 billion. And Merck is a pretty fascinating company in the sense that we have a healthcare business, a life science business, and a performance materials business. And yesterday we celebrated our 350th anniversary with Angela Merkel. And with, as we come in and we started looking around at these different areas, there was a strong desire to see how do we start applying digital technology beyond just the life science business. And to start, we wanted to first define how are we looking at digital and how are we looking at technology, and obviously data is a key role in this. The way we defined digitalization was how do we reduce friction and create value by integrating digital technologies into everyday life. And the framework that we wanted to put forth in doing this at Merck was start focusing on just what are people actually doing, right? And if you can use technology to make that person's life easier, you create value, right? And if you can then extract that value, you have a business model. And this is good because it gives us sustainability. It gives us a reason to let this grow. And as it grows, you start generating a lot of data. And the ability to then use that data to make that person's life even easier and the business model even more lucrative is really the framework that we were striving for. Now, obviously, a key portion of this is data, right? And so with the hubris of a company that just got bought for $17 billion, with e-commerce being a large part of it, we sent our data scientists into multiple parts of the business to start seeing what we could do. And we were humbled almost immediately. So we took one of our best data scientists. Her name was Claire. She was top of her class in stats at Yale, grad school at Columbia in stats, published her first peer-reviewed stats paper in a journal when she was 9 years old. And we sent her to China to help us with supply chain forecasting in our pharma business. We have a very large fertility business. And we were having difficulty predicting the demand as the one-child policy changed in China. And so Claire went there to help with this fun forecasting problem, and she spent 3 months trying to find data, right? And this was a very, very painful 3 months because after those 3 months, she basically was able to bring together data on monthly sales of our fertility products at a country level, right? And this is not good because it's not a very good way to retain very good data scientists when they spend 3 months digging around, not being able to find anything, not being able to make any of it usable, and then at the end of the day have really not good data and can only spend a little bit of time doing the math part of it, which is what they're there for. And so we kind of took a step back to say, what is it that we really need to create value from data, right? And if we want to create value from data, one, you have to have data, and that's kind of an obvious piece here. The second piece, though, is this data needs to be structured and usable. Then you can apply basic to advanced analytics to generate insights, and then finally you can act on those insights. And you really have to have someone to act to create that value. But while everyone tends to focus more on the third part of the problem, and a lot of companies are selling aspects that are focused on kind of the AI portion of this or the analytic portion of it, it's the second part that's really the hardest piece, right? Particularly in the healthcare side, where the data assets are just so much different than you see in other areas. And this is much easier said than done, even in areas where you think that the data should be fairly structured. So this is actually an insurance company's data landscape. It's how they actually do a calculation for their premium when they calculate their premium. So that top note at the very top is the insurance premium calculation, and everything below it are all the data sets that they're accessing for this. And so when we wanted to start doing this at more of a scale on the healthcare side, we needed to work with people to help us do this. We ended up partnering with Palantir because despite kind of what's said about them in the news, at their core, they provide tooling that allows you to integrate your data very, very easily for you to use it, right? And what it allows us to do is, this is an example of how we use it in our healthcare side. We can take all of our data assets and we can have somebody who's not necessarily a computer programmer go in and start structuring it because they know the context of the information. And so they treated the usability side of how do I determine context of data, cleanse it, and associate it with other data sets as a first-class problem, right? let me tell you, this is the least sexy problem on the planet, right? So it's not a very fun thing. And as a result, it is continuously not treated as a first-class problem, right? This is a first-class problem because this is the hardest part of what we have. And I can give you a sense of what changed here, right? So I mentioned we had Claire spending 3 months in China to get one product line, information on that, for basically monthly sales on this. In 2 months, we were able to integrate all of our product data across the entire country, every invoice that we had coming in, every slip that went on every package going out. And we were able to do this at an extremely granular level and increase our forecasting accuracy quite dramatically, about 11 percentage point improvement in that. The question now is, this is obviously a supply chain problem. And when we look at extending this to clinical data, this then brings a number of new challenges and also opportunities for us, right? What I see are, 3 kind of key problems that we need to address. And it's not just the industry side of this. This is everyone that's here, the industry, government, academia side. One, I see this usability problem is really key, right? I think what I wanted to emphasize in that story is that we're talking about how do we get lots of large groups to share information with one another. And what I'm pointing out is that not even one group can use the information it has effectively, right? And so if we want to do this at scale, we need to find a way to scale up the ability for individuals, individual entities and large entities to be able to contextualize the information they have in such a way that they can render it usable and then start asking them to see how they compound that with additional assets going forward. The second thing is incentive in this. There really isn't a clear incentive model that is in place for sharing that data. So even if we could bring all of this together, there's no ability to really incentivize this. And this could be monetary. It could also be via kind of an attribution mechanism that's there. One of the things that I think a lot about, especially having come from this life science side of the business where we're selling to scientists, is that our whole business with Sigma.com is based off of selling reagents and selling research tools in the form of packaged materials. But why couldn't we shift that model to almost like a Spotify model where you could have people contributing data to this and then pay out based on the usage and consumption of that person's data via others? And by doing so, actually, you can almost imagine research funding mechanisms happening in this manner. As people are then consuming information, they're getting paid out based on how useful the information is that they consume. This is something that we're spending a tremendous time looking at. You can imagine mechanisms like peer review coming in to be able to make these more trustworthy, and you have kind of the economic side on top to stabilize it. The third piece is scalable analytics, right? So one thing that I've noticed is the idea of AI and machine learning and all these cool buzzword things. So let's assume we get all of the other pieces figured out here, and then we get to the point that we can start applying some of these new technologies to it. What I tend to see in the sciences is bioinformaticians are really great at building these tools that are relevant to the scientific areas, right? They're really not as good at creating production level code that is scalable for millions of people to be able to use. And if we look at the amount of funding that's going into apps to deliver food to you on your couch faster versus AI tools to help treat people sooner and better, right? It's kind of outweighed right now here. And there needs to be a way for the scientists and bioinformaticians to be able to create production level tools at scale, right? And then the last piece is how do we then take action from this, right? And this was mentioned briefly before in the last talk, and I think this is a key point. Like, what is the action that is going to be taken? How is this going to be used? And do we trust it, right? And are we sure that this is the right thing to do? So I think there's some critical questions there that will need to be answered. I want to end on kind of this concept. I've been giving a lot of talks on this lately, and it's going to sound like a tangent story. I promise it's not. It'll come back. But I'm bombarded by consultants who come in and tell me that our industry is going to be destroyed and disrupted, and Amazon and Google are going to leave us homeless, and the world is doomed, right? They're going to take over everything. And I recently had one show me a slide that I thought was pretty funny. They showed me this slide with the market capitalization of Walmart versus Amazon, right, over time. And so you can imagine Walmart went down, right? Amazon went way up, and there was then this gap between the two. And they labeled that gap, that delta between Amazon and Walmart's market cap as disruption, right? And then at the top, this will probably happen, like disruption will happen to you, don't let it happen to you. And I see that graph kind of fundamentally different and fundamentally backwards in the sense that, you know, Amazon might be worth 5 times more than Walmart is today, but Walmart makes 5 times more revenue than Amazon does. And it turns out that they're profitable, which Amazon's retail business is not, right? And if you go into any Walmart store, the average price of something is much less, actually, than it costs on Amazon. And the funniest piece is that they have stores within 15 miles of 90% of the US population, right? That's a radical physical footprint, because if you look at those stores, those are like giant warehouses, right? And the sense of making life easier by being able to ship something to you fast, Amazon's doing this in one day. If you have stores within 15 miles of 90% of the population, you can ship stuff pretty fast if you can get your things together and actually execute on something like that and do the last mile. That would be wildly disruptive, right? That would be wildly disruptive because it leverages the industrial scale that industry has built up over time, a scale that no software company has, and it's much harder to spend a ton of money on physical infrastructure than it is to start spending some money on software, right? The question is really kind of leaning into it and making it happen. I mention this because, you know, I think this brings up a fundamental cultural problem, which is that defensive organizations rarely try new things, right? And so if we have all of industry being told they're on the verge or they are actively being disrupted, the likelihood of them wanting to try new things is probably pretty low, right? And I'm really pushing this concept of we need to have this disruptor mindset in here, which is how do we leverage the industrial scale that we have, not just from an industrial standpoint, but from any large organizational standpoint, to do things that even the disruptive companies cannot do. And I think if that can be done, we can have some really radical progress in a fairly short period of time. So with that, you know, thank you again for having me, and we can turn it over to questions.
Thank you so much, James. I don't know if we are the Amazon or the Walmart here. We can reflect on that. But any questions for James? Please.
Hi, Alison Bert from IQVIA. Have you got any feel how many other pharma industry companies are working in this sort of thinking about innovation in the digital space?
Yes. So I think I spent actually last week with a number of folks in the same role as me in pharma. And there's still kind of a push to figure out really what's happening on the mHealth side overall. You know, one kind of consistent struggle is figuring out, there are a lot of apps in the space, there are a lot of companies that are coming up in the space, but it's unclear what the business models of these companies are and how their valuation is coming the way that it is being valued, right? I think most of the valuations are the assumption that a pharma company that doesn't know anything about digital will pay that amount of money for them. But I think people are still trying to figure it out. You know, we're still trying to figure out how these things can really be used at scale in an effective manner. From the data side, I can tell you everyone is struggling with that, right? Everyone is struggling to find ways that we can make sense out of the information sets at hand or information sets from our partners. There's a tendency to fall into buzzwords very quickly, right? So AI, blockchain are probably two of the good ones right now. And it's from an AI side, I think we're continuously seeing that there are some difficulties in doing this. And there have been a number of cases where the companies have said, simply we were unaware of the state of the data. Right? We were trying to apply it. So that's it. Everyone is making a push. Everyone is deeply making a push to try to make sense of the information that they have, make sense of the information around them, and start using it more effectively.
Nigel Hughes from Janssen. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. It's curious that you talked about Amazon and Walmart, because as an example, a very different industry, clearly in today's world, if they don't have remarkable access to data and utilization of data, they're actually dead in the market, they have no market cap. Mm-hmm. And one of the key things that's quite different, I suppose, and is a real challenge at the heart of this in terms of healthcare versus another industry like in consumer and so forth, is in consumer, really, a lot of the data is given away freely, right? I mean, in Amazon, we are hemorrhaging data as customers and consumers all the time when we're using their services, and maybe also when we're not, but we don't know that. The same with Walmart. Everybody's utilizing this data. In healthcare, to date, one could argue there's never been such a incentive to date, even in the healthcare provision side of providing care to patients and in hospitals and primary care and so forth. It's never really been data driven, and it has never been an incentive really to improve what we do based on data. You arguably, it may be a bit provocative to say so, but that's a central challenge, I think, versus many other industries, and it's become an insular and rather peculiar aspect of healthcare. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
That's a phenomenal question. And it's actually the question is exactly why I showed that slide earlier on that pragmatically radical digitalization piece with user experience being first. Because my question is, how did Amazon get that data, right? Yes, they're a behemoth from a data standpoint now, but they got there for a reason, right? And when you look at it, the reason that they started getting this data was because they made people's lives a little bit easier. You didn't have to go to a store to buy a book. They shipped it to you in a short period of time, and they charged you less money for it. And so it's like, I don't have to go somewhere, and it's less money. Cool, right? More people start using it. When I look at the healthcare side, there are some opportunities to make people's life easier, I would say, but I think the question is going to be, what are those trigger points where we start saying, let's use technology to make people's lives actually easier? This could be patients, this could be providers, this could be the payers, this could be anyone that is in this whole economy of healthcare. But to date, there hasn't been, I think, really large pushes to facilitating that, right? And on the other side of it, those companies that I see that are trying to do that, a lot of those, I would call them kind of the digital health companies that are there, typically have very little understanding of the regulatory complexity of the environment and how to actually do this at some sort of scale, right? Because everything operates on the assumption that you can then scale to some global means. That's the whole kind of way that digital companies can be valued at that level. So I see this as a clear dichotomy between, yes, there is not this behemoth from a data standpoint in this because there has not been kind of that moment where there's been a trigger that has caused life to get significantly easier due to technology, and those that are trying to do it can't move into this regulated area.
Thank you. Peter?
Thanks, Peter Arlott, EMA. Really nice presentation. I just wanted to sort of bring it closer to home, and it's actually a closely related question to the previous one. I like the concept of disrupt the disruptors, but the question for me is whether you could give any insight into who or what you think the disruptors are now or in the coming years, both for the industry and for regulators.
Yeah, I actually don't know if, I see it more as a conceptual disruptor, right? And the point that I'm trying to make in it is more that I see there being paralysis of fear of these companies that we see as disruptive suddenly moving into this space in some way, right? I mean, there's a persistent kind of set of questions that we get around, what about Amazon, what about Google? And it's kind of like, okay, what about them? And yet this is kind of a constant bombardment that you get. This is amplified by I think, shareholders and kind of the industry that has come around consulting and terrifying everyone that they're going to be disrupted so that they have to get services. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily sure that I know where they're coming from. I like to believe that we will be a disruptor in this, right? Because we have a unique combination of things, the healthcare and the life science business that's there, right? But I think it can come from anywhere, but more it's a mindset change that I'm trying to get across in this, that a defensive company will not change, right? They're going to be, it's very hard to get them to make a radical change of course.
It's much closer to home. The disruptor for us as people that make decisions on medicines and whether they're on the market and how they're used would be if we can use big data, observational data, to make better decisions quicker and not have to have clinical trials or not have to rely totally on clinical trials, I guess. And making that step, that goes back to Bert's presentation, making that step to decision making at the moment is we're only at the margins, because fundamentally to get a product on the market, we're still talking about clinical trials largely.
So that's a really interesting one, because I don't know if I would describe that as a disruptor to you. I see that as an enabler for you, right? So when we talk about how do we make life easier, I feel like your life would be a lot easier if you were able to pull all of the data together from all of the trials really quickly and easily and come up with mathematical models that are telling you exactly what should be done at any point in time, and be able to then give that out as guidance to the rest of the world. The rest of the world would appreciate that tremendously, because then they would know that they're not going to be liable if one of these things go wrong, or they at least have some feeling of confidence in the system. So I see that as like one of the absolute best examples of how you make someone's life easier with technology, and your life easier in particular in there.
Hi, it's David Gillen from UCOPE. I'm just thinking about your point, which I think was a really good one, about making lives easier. Do you think that ultimately we're going to need much more active, if you like, input from the real user, the end user, the patient, in order to facilitate this process? At the moment, again, the difference in even thinking about your previous experience, where you're having a relationship directly with the end user, being the researcher, we have the intermediary, if you will, the healthcare professional. Of course, there are lots of people in the room who are healthcare professionals. I'm just curious if you're thinking that ultimately we need more direct involvement from patients into sort of the data collection in order to try and improve this.
Absolutely. And I think this, a lot of this, I think, comes down to, one, informed consent of patient and understanding, if they want to share their data, that they can then, share it, and they know how it's going to be used throughout this entire journey. The second side is, when I get into that incentive structure, the ultimate disintermediation is to be able to go straight to the patient, right? I mean, it's actually kind of crazy if you think about the data ecosystem that exists today in the healthcare world. And the patient tends to be at the losing end of it every time, right? They are sick, they're paying for services, and yet the data that is created about them is then being bought and sold between 18 different steps until it finally gets to a party that's trying to do something about it. That's frustrating, and I see the ultimate disintermediation there is if you can get the patient to sell the data on their own. Right? The question, though, is that data useful, right, for the person that wants to do something about it at that stage, right? And it's not. You need to have the physician there. You need to have these kind of other steps there to be able to create what I would say are the annotations on this asset, the cleansing of the asset that can then join it to a larger set that makes it useful. The question that I am grappling with consistently is, how do we take all of those points of where value is truly being added, and it's not just a transaction between a party, right? And have some attribution mechanism behind it, so that either it's a monetary incentive flow that goes back, or it's an attribution flow that goes back. And the best kind of example of an attribution flow would be, can we take the equivalent of a person being an author of a paper and have that same type of kind of pedigree that you get from this being given to somebody who is a great generator of data that lots of people use, or a great annotator of information that is then used by lots of others? It needs to be one or the other, but there needs to be an incentive in this. And it's not just one that's going to be there, but there are a lot of middle steps that can be cut out, certainly.
I think we're going to have to stop, Maybe we pick up more on data sharing, cultures, and incentivizing in the workshops. But thank you very much,
Perfect.
James.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
We now have a coffee break until, well, just over 10 minutes, till 10:25. I know it's short. If you could grab a coffee and maybe drink it quickly and come back, that would be great. Okay.